Simcha, celebration, Simcha, Simcha, celebration of life.
Hello, welcome to Simcha, a celebration of life. I'm Nikki Wallman. Strongly influenced by the teachings of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, Rabbi Gavin Michael is the spiritual leader of the Baal Shem Tov Shul in Orange Grove, Johannesburg. Breslov Hasidus, which follows the path and teachings of Rabbi Nachman, is thriving in Israel and elsewhere as the fastest growing Jewish movement in the world today. Rabbi Nachman was the great-grandson of Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov, who led one of the greatest spiritual revolutions amongst the Jewish people 200 years ago. Rabbi Michael, in fact, built and designed his shul modeled on the Breslov Synagogue synagogue in the Ukraine.
One of the most inspiring places that I'd ever been to in my life was a little town in Israel called Tzfat. And there's a wonderful, wonderful atmosphere, these beautiful, beautiful old shuls. And you just walk inside the shul and you don't even need anything else. The building itself kind of takes you into a certain space. That's exactly what we've tried to recreate over here. We started our shul about 17 years ago. We've introduced rock stones. None of them are dressed, it means none of them have been cut. They're all natural corners. We've tried to recreate some of the arches that you see in, with some of the vaulted ceilings in Tzfat. On the side of the walls we have a chamsa, what's supposed to represent a person sort of saying stop to anything negative from coming within the space. We've got leaves to kind of make the shul look a little bit more earthy. For our mechitza, that's the space that traditionally separates men from women. We took the lowest possible measurement that we could use for the height of a mechitza. We got some top rabbis whom we consulted with, and we put plants and arches so that the women, while we qualify as having a kosher mechitza, the women and the men do not feel necessarily separated. And we also pray side by side, so we don't necessarily have to look at each other, but we're praying together with the same perspective, the same view. Yeah, we're on the same journey. We have stones from the graves of many, many of our tzaddikim, ranging from some of the rabbis in the Talmud, right up to people like the Baal Shem Tov, Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, who were buried in parts of Russia and Europe, Ukraine. And we've collected stones. We've sent people to the graves. I've been to many of these graves myself. It's based on a teaching that I once came across. It says that the grave of a tzaddik has a certain holiness that extends to an area of 4 square amot. But it kind of creates a nice atmosphere. It's very nice to see a stone that was probably last touched by a human being 400, 500, 600 years ago, now hanging up on the wall over here from the grave of people whose teachings we still study to this day. So for us it's something very, very meaningful. At the back of our shul we've got a picture of the Baal Shem Tov's original shul. Now our shul is called the Baal Shem Tov shul. So as you walk into here, the first thing to sort of greet you is a depiction of the Baal Shem Tov's original shul that stood some 300 odd years ago in Eastern Europe. I came across his signature in an old manuscript, and it was a fascinating signature because it had all sorts of interesting squiggles. But we got hold of an artist who was very good at recreating signatures of artists. She blew it up, painted the outline on the wall, which we then later came in and inked in. And to the best of my knowledge, it's a very, very accurate depiction of the real signature of the Baal Shem Tov himself. The kind of people that we cater for here in the shul are people who are looking for something fairly deep in their Judaism, in their quest for God and spirituality. But at the same time, we are very, very comfortable about our approach to spirituality. We don't impose too many restrictions on people. We try to make people feel at home, and we try to make people comfortable. And our community has grown very, very substantially over the years. And on a Shabbos morning, on a Shabbos even in the morning, weekday morning, we have a very, very wonderful atmosphere and a wonderful vibe. I've taken some of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov's teachings and actually painted them on the wall. One of his teachings, it's one of the teachings on the wall, it says that from God himself comes neither good nor bad, but neutral, a kind of a neutral light. And it's up to the human being to determine what he does with that light. So these statements kind of reflect the ethos, I think, of our shul and of our community.
Moses was the greatest prophet, teacher, and leader that Judaism has ever known. He is called Moshe Rabbeinu, which means Moses, our teacher or rabbi. In the 13 principles of Jewish faith composed by the Rambam, we find that the 9th principle of faith is based on the belief that the Torah given to Moses on Mount Sinai is entirely unchangeable and never to be superseded by any revelation.
One of the most important of the 13 principles of faith is the fact that God gave us the Torah at Mount Sinai 3,323 years ago. We have an exact year and date for it, the 6th of Sivan, the Hebrew month of Sivan, 3,323 years ago. And what that means, to believe that God gave us the Torah, it means that he actually did, that he arrived on Mount Sinai and we heard from him the 10 commandments, and then he gave the entire Torah over to Moses, who taught it to the people. But the entire people heard the 10 commandments and also heard God's instructions that he would be handing the details of the Torah on to Moses, who handed it on to the people. And for those 40 years in the desert, they lived with God's presence. There was a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. God's presence rested in a tangible form that people could see on the tabernacle, and there was a constant teaching of the Torah for those 40 years, from Moses to Aaron to the 70 elders to the entire people. This is very important because it says that the Torah itself that we have, the 5 books, the Talmud, the way that we live Judaism today, is not something that human beings invented. It's not something that we woke up one day and decided, oh, this is a nice way of life. Or that in other cultures you have certain cultural practices and even religious practices that have developed over the ages. Rather, this is the direct word of God. And that means it has eternal relevance. At the heart and soul of the 13 principles of faith is the concept that God gave us the Torah, but for all times and all places. I'm sure you may have heard me quote very often the words of one of the great rabbis of the 20th century, Rabbi Mordechai Pinchas Teitz, who lived in Elizabeth, New Jersey. And he came from Eastern Europe to America just before the war broke out. And in America, after the Second World War, there were lots of immigrants who'd come in from Eastern Europe. And there was a feeling after the destruction of Europe that in a sense Judaism was over, that it was no longer relevant. Here was a modern society with all of these huge technological developments and economic growth and all the kinds of things that were happening, and that in a sense Judaism belonged to the old country. And he came up with a phrase which, from the first time that I read it, made such an impression on me, and I think it encapsulates so much of what Judaism is really about. And he said it as follows: the Torah speaks in the language of tomorrow. And that is a guiding principle, but it was symbolic of the fact that Judaism is relevant to all times, all places, to the 20th century, to the 21st century. It doesn't matter the level of technological innovation. We can be dealing with iPods and iPads and all kinds of different things. But Judaism is a blueprint. It is a blueprint from God of how to live life, and it has eternal relevance because God knows the future and He knows all of the circumstances we're going to arrive. And He gave us His Torah for all times and all places. And so we need to view it as such. It's not just about how we behave. Of course it is, the commandments are about how we behave, but the 13 principles of faith teach us how to think. And the eternal relevance of the Torah teaches us to look at every situation in life from the perspective of Torah. And our Torah studies, whether it's in the Chumash or whether it's in the Talmud, right across all of the writings of our great sages over all the years, speaks about psychology and history, speaks about business and marriage and parenting and politics and government and economies. Everything that takes place within the frame of human activity is discussed in the Torah because it's the blueprint for everything. As the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot says, turn it over and over, for everything is in it. And that's what the principle of faith about the eternal relevance of the Torah and the fact that God gave it. This is God's wisdom. This is not just human wisdom. This is God's wisdom for all times and all places. The Torah speaks in the language of tomorrow.
Well, that brings us to the end of this week's show. Thank you so much for joining us, and please don't forget to tune in, same time, next Sunday. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the show, so please find us on Facebook at Spirit Sister Productions Network. As always, from me, Nikki, and the team, shalom and have a safe and peaceful week.